Karen slaps bride at her own wedding. Then the groom drops a bombshell. The sky stretched bright and cloudless above the sprawling luxury estate, where white tents shimmered in the sun and fountains trickled beside manicured hedges. Leela adjusted the veil on her head as she stared at herself in the full-length mirror inside the bridal suite. Her heart beat fast with a cocktail of nerves and anticipation, her satin gown hugging her figure perfectly, the subtle pearls catching the light with every breath she took. Around her, the bridesmaids fluttered like pastel butterflies, making last-minute fixes to hair and dresses, whispering words of excitement and love. There was laughter, perfume, and champagne in the air, a moment that felt suspended in time. But even amid the joy, Leela couldn't ignore the cold, constant pressure of Aunt Karen's disapproving presence lurking at the edge of everything. Karen had made her entrance earlier that morning in a beige suit 2 decades out of style and enough perfume to gas a room. She immediately began picking at every detail like it was her sacred duty. The flower arrangements were too cheap-looking, the food options were too pretentious, and even the string quartet playing near the reception hall didn't meet her lofty standards. She hovered like a hawk, arms folded tight, eyes scanning the venue with a permanent scowl carved into her face. Leela had braced herself for this. Karen was her mother's older sister and had taken on a self-appointed matriarch role after Leela's parents passed away. She'd been a guardian for a time, but never a mother, more like a judge with a scorecard. Still, Leela had invited her out of obligation, hoping that today of all days, Karen might let go of old resentments and be part of something beautiful. But no, of course not. Still going through with it, I see, Karen said flatly when she caught Leela alone in the bridal suite, her voice thick with disdain. She didn't bother knocking, just let herself in like she owned the air inside. Not too late to call it off. You know, people would understand. Leela's back straightened slightly as she turned to face her aunt, clutching her bouquet with both hands to keep from trembling. Karen, please, can we not do this today? Karen smirked and walked closer, adjusting her gold watch as if the confrontation was just another task on her to-do list. You think marrying Ethan will solve everything? I've seen how fast men can change after the ceremony. You're too young, too naive to think love is enough. And you never once listened to my advice. I warned you about depending on that man. He's not like that, Leela snapped, her voice firm but measured. He's been nothing but supportive. He's kind, he's honest. Karen scoffed and crossed her arms. Honest, right? We'll see how honest he is when the truth comes out. There was something in Karen's eyes, something smug, almost cruel. Leela swallowed the lump rising in her throat and turned back to the mirror. She had to stay focused. The ceremony was only an hour away. She wouldn't let Karen get to her. She wouldn't let the bitterness of a woman who had never been happy sabotage the most important day of her life. Downstairs, Ethan moved through the garden paths, greeting guests as they arrived. His tuxedo was crisp, his smile steady, though his best man, Drew, could see the tension in his jaw. Ethan was aware that Karen was already causing a stir. He'd overheard her berating one of the waitstaff for being too slow and saw her turning her nose up at the hors d'oeuvres being passed around. He knew Leela was probably stressed, and it pained him not to be there beside her right now. But he was determined to keep the peace, at least until they said their vows. He had made a promise, not just to Leela but to himself, that nothing would ruin their moment. As the ceremony time crept closer, the venue began to buzz with excitement. Guests took their seats beneath a massive floral arch, cameras ready, smiles wide. Ethan stood at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him while the officiant gave him a reassuring nod. Drew leaned over and whispered, "If Karen tries anything, I've got a speech of my own planned." Ethan gave a faint laugh, grateful for the support but silently hoping it wouldn't come to that. Back in the bridal suite, Leela took a deep breath as the wedding planner appeared at the door. "It's time," she said softly, a smile lighting up her face. The music began to drift from the garden, the first notes of the wedding march, and Leela was led down the grand staircase, her dress cascading behind her like a river of white silk. Her heart pounded, and her eyes welled with tears the moment she caught sight of Ethan waiting for her at the end of the aisle. In that moment, all her nerves vanished. The world blurred around her, and all she could see was the man she loved. But behind her, Karen sat rigid in the front row, eyes narrowed and jaw clenched, her hands balled into fists in her lap. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't moved. She was calculating. As Leela reached the altar and took Ethan's hand, Karen's voice whispered sharply to the woman beside her. She has no idea what she's walking into. The ceremony began, the officiant welcoming the guests, speaking about love, unity, and commitment. Ethan spoke his vows first, sincere and heartfelt, every word trembling with emotion. He spoke of the day he met Leela, how she changed him, how he saw the future in her eyes. Everyone was captivated. Then it was Leela's turn. She smiled through tears, just about to begin, when a chair scraped violently against the ground. Karen stood. A cold silence fell. Everyone turned toward her. Leela blinked in disbelief. "Karen, what are you doing?" Karen didn't flinch. "I won't sit here and let this happen." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan tightened his grip on Leela's hand. The officiant hesitated, unsure what to do. Karen took a step forward, her voice rising. "This whole thing is a lie. You think you're marrying a man you can trust. You think you know what love is. You're making a mistake, Leela, one you'll regret." "Karen, that's enough," someone hissed from the front row. But Karen wasn't done. Before anyone could stop her, she marched up the aisle. With a sharp, sudden movement, she raised her hand, then slapped Leela hard across the face. Gasps rang out. Leela's head whipped to the side. Her bouquet fell to the ground. Karen stood over her niece, breathing heavily, her eyes wild. Then, just as security and family rushed forward, Ethan stepped between them, a calm fury radiating from him. The crowd was silent, and Ethan said in a low, even voice, "If you want to play dirty, Karen, fine, but you're not the only one with secrets." The wedding had shattered, but something bigger, something far more explosive, was about to begin. The echo of the slap seemed to hang in the air long after Karen's hand had dropped, as though the act itself had stunned time into silence. Leela stood frozen, her cheek flushed crimson and her heart thundering in her ears. The petals of her bouquet lay scattered at her feet like broken promises. All around, guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unsure whether to intervene, speak, or pretend they hadn't just witnessed the wedding transform into a spectacle. The bridesmaids gasped in unison, and Ethan's mother put her hands to her mouth in horror, while the string quartet faltered, their bows hovering uncertainly in the air. Ethan stood in front of Leela like a human shield, his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed coldly on the woman who had dared lay a hand on his bride. Karen didn't flinch. If anything, she looked proud, righteous, even. Her chest rose and fell with indignation, and she held her chin high as if she'd done the one thing no one else had the courage to do. "I won't apologize," she snapped before anyone could speak. Someone had to do it. Someone had to wake her up from this fantasy. The officiant looked to Ethan, silently asking if they should proceed, but Ethan raised a hand, signaling a pause. His voice was calm, but each word was laced with steel. "You've done enough, Karen. You've humiliated Leela. You've ruined what was supposed to be a sacred moment. But if you want to air dirty laundry, maybe it's time we start with yours." Karen's smug expression flickered just for a second, but it was enough. Ethan turned slightly, lifting the mic from the stand and stepping forward. His eyes swept across the crowd, many of whom leaned forward in their seats, faces a mixture of confusion, discomfort, and curiosity. "I didn't want to do this," he began, his voice steady. "This was supposed to be a joyful day, a day for love, for family. But sometimes the truth refuses to stay buried." Karen let out a mocking laugh, clearly trying to regain control of the room. "What truth, Ethan? That I've been the only one in this family willing to say what needs to be said, that I've watched you manipulate Leela." "No," Ethan cut in, his voice rising just enough to command attention. The truth is that you've spent the last 10 years feeding off Leela's inheritance, the money her father left for her future. Money that mysteriously disappeared when you were acting as her guardian. A stunned silence fell over the garden. Leela blinked, her eyes locking onto Ethan, as if to confirm she had heard him right. Cairn's face turned several shades paler, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For once, she was speechless. Ethan continued, pulling a folded document from his inner jacket pocket. When Leela and I got engaged, she told me there was nothing left from her parents. She blamed lawyers, fees, bad investments, but something didn't sit right, so I hired a forensic accountant. He paused, letting the gravity of that statement sink in. What we found was a paper trail. Cairn had been withdrawing funds in small increments for years, hiding it under false business expenses, using shell accounts, even forging Leela's signature on a few occasions. Cairn found her voice at last, though it came out strained and high-pitched. "That's a lie. You forged those documents yourself. This is slander." "No, it's fact," Ethan said, holding up a second sheet. "I have signed statements from 2 different financial institutions and a handwriting expert. Leela could take you to court tomorrow and win everything back, with interest. But she didn't want to cause drama. She didn't want to destroy the family." All eyes shifted to Leela, who looked like the earth had fallen out from under her feet. She shook her head slowly, her lips parting but no words forming. Cairn took a step forward, her bravado cracking as she pointed a trembling finger at her niece. "You knew. You let him dig through our private affairs. After everything I did for you." "You didn't do anything for me," Leela finally said, her voice hoarse. "You kept me out of college. You told me it was too expensive. You made me feel like a burden in my own home. And all this time you were stealing from me." Cairn tried to regain her footing, tried to summon that righteous fury again, but it was gone, slipping from her like water through clenched fists. She turned to the guests, desperate now. "She's ungrateful. I took her in. I gave her a roof, food, clothes. And in exchange, you took her future," Ethan said bluntly. "You kept her small so you could feel important. That's not love, that's control." Security, finally alerted to the scene's escalation, arrived at the edge of the aisle. One of the venue managers stepped forward to intervene, asking quietly if Cairn should be removed. Ethan didn't need to respond. Cairn let out a furious shriek, her eyes wide with betrayal, and stormed off down the aisle without another word. No one tried to stop her. In fact, several guests turned away, ashamed they had ever laughed at her jokes or tolerated her complaints. She had always been overbearing, but now she was exposed. As the sound of her heels clicking down the marble steps faded into the distance, Ethan turned to Leela and reached out gently, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "I'm sorry it came out like that," he whispered. "I didn't want to humiliate her, but I couldn't let her hurt you anymore." Leela stared at him for a moment, then took his hand, gripping it tightly. "You protected me," she said, her voice breaking, "when no one else ever did." The officiant, unsure whether to proceed, cleared his throat hesitantly. "Would you like to continue?" Leela looked around at the guests, at the archway still standing tall behind them, the flowers still blooming despite everything. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I think we all need to be reminded what love is really supposed to look like." As the ceremony resumed, quieter this time, more intimate, the guests leaned in not out of politeness but from genuine interest. This was no longer just a wedding, it was a reclaiming, a resurrection. And as Leela began her vows, her voice steady and clear, there was no trace of fear left in her. Cairn might have tried to destroy her moment, but in doing so, she had only revealed her own rot. What remained standing was stronger than ever. The soft hum of conversations returned to the reception grounds like a cautious tide coming back to shore after a storm. Cairn's departure had left a charged silence in her wake, but slowly, laughter and the clinking of glasses began to rise again under the canopy of twinkling lights. The ceremony had finished not with a sense of mere completion, but with the quiet dignity of 2 people refusing to let bitterness define their day. As the final vows were exchanged and the officiant declared them husband and wife, Ethan and Leela kissed not only with love but with a fierce, mutual relief, as though sealing a bond forged in fire. The guests stood and applauded, not out of formality but with genuine affection. Whatever tension had lingered was swept away by the sight of a bride and groom choosing joy over chaos. Inside the grand reception hall, white linen tables stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, each adorned with elegant centerpieces of orchids and cascading ivy. The wedding planner and staff, shaken but professional, had smoothed over the disruption with expert hands, swapping out a shattered champagne flute, repairing a trampled floral display, and coordinating the catering team to keep the celebration flowing. But even amid the gentle elegance of the room, there was still a buzz of quiet curiosity. Guests whispered in corners, exchanging theories and side glances. Some pulled out their phones to search for details, while others stared at Leela with a new kind of reverence. She had endured public humiliation with poise, and now moved through the room arm in arm with Ethan, accepting congratulations, smiling graciously, though her eyes still betrayed the exhaustion of the day's emotional toll. At their table, Leela finally sat down, exhaling as though she'd been holding her breath for hours. Ethan poured her a glass of champagne and offered a soft smile. "You did amazing," he said quietly, his hand resting gently on hers. Leela shook her head and gave a weary laugh. "I still can't believe it happened. She slapped me, in front of everyone." "I know," he replied, his voice low but certain, "and she'll have to live with that forever, not you." She nodded, her eyes flicking around the room. "They're all looking at us." "Let them," Ethan said simply. "They're looking because they saw the truth today, and the truth didn't break you, it made you stronger." As dinner was served and the first course began, the MC stepped up to the microphone, hesitating slightly before flashing a practiced smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for your patience today, and thank you to our beautiful couple who have shown all of us what grace and courage look like. Now, let's toast to love, resilience, and the beginning of a new chapter." The applause was louder this time, stronger, more united. Glasses clinked all across the hall. Slowly, the mood lifted. Laughter returned. The band struck up a soft jazz tune, and then came the toasts. Drew, Ethan's best man, stood and adjusted his tie before taking the mic. "I've known Ethan since college," he began, his tone light and familiar. "And if you had told me back then that he'd one day stand up in front of 100 people and destroy a family tyrant with a stack of documents and a smirk, I'd have said, yeah, that checks out." The crowd laughed. Leela even let out a small giggle, which seemed to ease the knot in Ethan's chest. "But in all seriousness," Drew continued, "what we saw today wasn't just a couple getting married. It was a man standing up for the woman he loves, and a woman who, despite being blindsided in the worst possible way, stood taller than anyone else in the room. That's not just romance, that's partnership. That's the kind of love that makes people believe in second chances and fresh starts." Another round of applause followed. Ethan rose from his seat and clapped Drew on the back as he returned to the table. Then came the maid of honor's speech, heartfelt and tearful, recounting childhood memories of Leela, the years of quiet struggle, and how she had always managed to smile through it. Leela wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed by the emotional outpouring. It was as if everyone in the room, for the first time, truly saw her, not as some helpless orphan passed between relatives, not as the quiet girl who had always stepped aside, but as a woman who had finally taken center stage in her own life. Later in the evening, after the cake had been cut and the dance floor had begun to fill, Ethan pulled Leela aside toward the edge of the garden where the lights were dimmer, and the world felt just a little more still. The string lights above them glowed gold, and the night air was soft with the scent of jasmine. He took both her hands in his and kissed her knuckles gently. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice quiet. Leela tilted her head. "We're already married, you know." He smiled, but his expression quickly turned serious. "I mean it. Now that this is done, now that she's out of our lives, what do you want to do about it? About the money, the lies, everything." Leela looked down for a moment, then out toward the moonlit path. "Part of me wants to let it go, to just move on and pretend none of it happened. But I can't. Not because of revenge or pride, but because I want the truth to matter. Not just for me, but for the girl I used to be, the one who thought she was just unlucky instead of being robbed." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then we'll do it together. We'll take her to court if that's what you want, and I'll be right beside you the whole way." Leela leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, her voice a whisper. "I married the right man." They stood there for a moment in silence, the noise of the reception fading into the background. And then the MC's voice called out again, summoning the couple for their first dance. As they moved to the center of the dance floor, guests gathered around them in a wide circle, their faces glowing in the candlelight. The music swelled, an old love song played by the live band, and Ethan took Leela into his arms. They swayed together, slow and steady, her head on his chest, his hand at her waist. The world narrowed down to just them. There was no cairn now, no past, no shame. Just the rhythm of hearts finally beating in sync, and a future that, for the first time in a long time, belonged to Leela and no one else. The night deepened around the luxury estate, stars blooming across the velvet sky, as though the universe itself had come to bear witness to the unfolding of a love forged in resilience. The reception was in full swing now, the earlier drama replaced by warmth, laughter, and the clink of champagne glasses raised in toasts to second chances. Guests danced beneath the crystal chandeliers, the music spilling out into the gardens where flickering candles floated in the marble fountains. Leela moved gracefully from one group to the next, her hand often linked with Ethan, as they shared stories, thanked guests for coming, and accepted heartfelt congratulations from friends and family who had never seen her smile with such peace. But not everyone had let the day go. In the shadows of the parking area just beyond the venue's outer path, Karen sat in her car with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel with both hands as her knuckles turned white. She had been sitting there for over an hour, watching from a distance, her face twisted with a mixture of rage, humiliation, and denial. Her carefully applied makeup had smudged, and her hair hung limply around her shoulders. The sting of her public shamming replayed on a loop in her mind, Ethan's calm exposure of her theft, the guests' horrified stares, the way no one had stood up for her. Worst of all, the look in Leela's eyes, not one of sadness or confusion, but clarity, strength. That girl had dared to stare her down, unshaken. Karen had spent years reminding Leela of her place, tightening the grip of guilt and control with subtle words and cold silences. To see her now, radiant and unafraid, was intolerable. She had meant to ruin Leela's wedding, not gift her a moment of triumph. As if possessed by something primal, Karen swung the door open and stepped out, her heels clicking against the stone walkway as she made her way back toward the venue. Security had let down their guard, assuming the threat was gone with the slap and scandal already past. But Karen wasn't done. She needed to reclaim control, needed to reassert the narrative that had been ripped from her grasp. She walked fast, her breath quick and sharp, the heels of her shoes digging into the damp grass as she skirted the back path around the building, eyes darting through the soft glow of lanterns strung along the hedges. Inside the reception hall, Ethan stood at the sweetheart table with a glass of red wine in one hand, watching Leela dance with her childhood friend in the center of the room. Her laughter rang out clearly, light and unguarded, her dress spinning in a blur of white silk. He smiled to himself, marveling at the woman she had become. Every obstacle she had faced, every cruelty, every unkindness, had only made her more brilliant. He had seen it when they met, that quiet flame beneath the surface, and now it burned openly. Drew approached with a plate of cake and raised an eyebrow. "You think she'll try to come back?" Drew asked, voice low. Ethan didn't look away from Leela. "She already has. It's just a question of how far she wants to fall." Back near the catering corridor, a staff member spotted Karen slipping through a side door and rushed toward the head of security. But she was quick. She cut through the back hallway and re-emerged near the main floor, adjusting her blazer, steeling her face into one of practiced confidence. Guests turned, startled, as she stepped into the room, but this time her voice was not loud. It was low, cutting, dangerous. She walked straight up to the mic stand, her eyes locked on Leela, who had frozen mid-dance. "I wasn't finished," Karen said, her voice shaking with anger. "You all want to believe that little fairy tale Ethan spun, that I'm some villain who took advantage of a poor orphan girl. You don't know the truth. You don't know what I sacrificed." Leela stepped forward immediately, no fear in her posture. "Karen, this is done. You need to leave." Karen ignored her, gripping the mic harder. "You think I enjoyed raising someone else's child. You think it was easy, giving up my own plans to look after you. I gave you everything. And now you stand here pretending you were some victim." The room fell into a stunned hush. Ethan moved toward the stage, but Leela raised her hand to stop him. She stepped forward slowly, eyes never leaving her aunt. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "You didn't raise me," Leela said. "You tolerated me, you used me, and you resented me every day I lived in your house. You were a mother to me. You were an obstacle, and I blamed myself for years because I thought I owed you something for taking me in, but not anymore." Karen's mouth opened, but Leela kept going, her voice rising with each word. "You didn't give up your plans for me. You lost control of your life and needed someone else to blame. That wasn't my fault. And you don't get to stand here and rewrite history just because it makes you feel better." The guests stood in silence, some covering their mouths, others nodding slowly. Karen's face flushed deep red. She turned toward the crowd but found only cold stares and folded arms. No one backed her. No one came to her defense. She looked to the exit, her chest heaving, then back to Leela, who stood tall and radiant beneath the lights. Defeated, Karen dropped the mic. It clattered against the floor, the final note in her failed performance, and she turned and stormed out for the second and final time. Security followed to ensure she left the premises completely, this time with no opportunity to linger or sneak back in. The doors closed behind her like the end of a long, bitter chapter. The room exhaled. The DJ, after a pause, eased back into music with a slow instrumental, and the guests returned to their seats, speaking in hushed tones. Ethan came to Leela's side and took her hand. "Are you okay?" She looked at him, her eyes moist but not broken. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think I finally am." Together they returned to the dance floor. No one stopped them. No one looked away. They danced again, this time not just as newlyweds but as survivors of abuse, of manipulation, of ghosts that had haunted their past for too long. They didn't need a speech. They didn't need a finale. Their love, defiant and untouchable, was the final word. The final hour of the reception unfolded like the closing act of a grand performance, not hurried or chaotic, but filled with a warmth that had been hard-earned. Guests lingered longer than expected, unwilling to let the evening end, caught in the rare glow of witnessing something both deeply human and undeniably beautiful. Leela and Ethan were no longer just a bride and groom in the eyes of those who watched them. They had become something more, symbols of quiet endurance, of standing tall when shadows threatened to crush the light. The music had shifted from celebration to soul, the kind that wrapped around people like a soft blanket, and everywhere couples swayed in time, smiling, whispering, reconnecting. Leela found herself surrounded by old friends and distant cousins she hadn't spoken to in years, each one offering heartfelt words, apologies for not knowing sooner, praises for her strength, and blessings for the future she had carved out with her own hands. Outside, the night was calm and cool, a breeze stirring the lace curtains at the edge of the open reception doors. Staff began collecting used glasses and empty plates, clearing tables with careful hands, while children who had long kicked off their shoes played near the fountain, their laughter echoing under the moonlight. Ethan stood just inside the archway, one arm resting casually against the column, watching his wife move among the crowd with a grace that stunned him still. She was glowing in a way that no makeup could fake, a light that came from within, one born of survival, not suffering. He had fallen in love with her quietly, gradually, but watching her now, he realized just how deeply that love had rooted itself in him. It wasn't just affection, it was awe. Leela approached him moments later, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright, slipping her hand into his. "Everyone keeps telling me how brave I am," she said with a laugh, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "I don't feel brave, I feel relieved." Ethan leaned in and pressed a kiss to her temple, letting her rest her head briefly against his shoulder. "That's what bravery is sometimes. Not roaring, just surviving, choosing not to run." She was quiet for a beat, then looked up at him. "Do you think she'll come after us legally, try to sue or spin it into some twisted counterattack?" He shook his head gently. "She won't. The evidence is solid and even she knows that now. She'll lash out, maybe try to play the victim to a few friends, but no one will believe her. She's done, and if she tries, we'll be ready." Leela nodded, then stepped back slightly and looked around. "Do you realize what just happened? For the first time in my life, I'm free of her. I'm not looking over my shoulder. I'm not wondering if she'll approve. It's like breathing real air after years of fog." They moved back toward the dance floor as the band began playing a slow, melodic tune. Ethan guided her into a sway, and for the first time that day, the world finally felt still. As they danced, heads rested against shoulders, the guests around them began to form a circle again, not in anticipation of drama, but as a closing tribute. Candles were lit and passed from one guest to another, creating a ring of soft light around the couple. Someone whispered the idea, and soon the circle grew, warm and glowing, an unspoken message that Leela and Ethan were now surrounded not by chaos, but by love. It was then that Ethan's mother stepped forward, holding something in her hands. She approached carefully, catching Leela's gaze with a kind smile. "This was your mother," she said gently, revealing a delicate bracelet of woven gold with a single sapphire at the center. "She gave it to me years ago, said she wanted me to hold on to it for you. I think now's the right time." Leela stared at the piece of jewelry, her throat tightening. She hadn't seen that bracelet since she was a child, since before the accident. Karen had always claimed there was nothing left from her parents' belongings, that everything had been donated or sold. But here it was, something real, something pure, a tether to her roots. Tears welled in her eyes as she accepted it, clasping it onto her wrist like armor. "Thank you," she whispered, then hugged Ethan's mother tightly, feeling a sense of family she hadn't felt in a very long time. The final toast came not from the best man, nor the maid of honor, but from one of the venue's servers, an older man with silver hair who had witnessed everything quietly from the sidelines. He stepped up to the microphone with the gentle confidence of someone who had seen hundreds of weddings and knew which ones would last. "I've worked this job a long time," he began, his voice smooth and weathered, "and I've seen every kind of wedding there is. Big, small, dramatic, simple, but what I saw today was something different. It wasn't just a couple saying, 'I do.' It was a woman standing in her power, a man honoring that power, and together turning something ugly into something unforgettable. That's rare, that's real." Applause followed, not boisterous but warm and respectful. It wasn't a show anymore. It was real people honoring real love. As the last dance played and the final photos were taken, Leela and Ethan stole away for a moment beneath the stars. They stood at the edge of the hill overlooking the estate, the lights of the reception glowing behind them like lanterns in the dark. Leela leaned against him, her hand finding his. "So," she said, her voice thoughtful, "what do we do now?" Ethan smiled. "Now we build a life that's ours with no strings attached, no debts owed, just us." She tilted her head toward him, her eyes shining. "Sounds perfect." He kissed her slowly, their silhouettes framed by the moonlight and the faint music drifting up from below. There was no curtain call, no dramatic crescendo, just two people who had faced down the worst day of their lives and walked out holding hands. And in that quiet, unshakable moment, the story truly ended, not with vengeance or shouting, but with a calm, defiant love that needed no defense. They were free,